Hello, everybody, and welcome again to the online Peace Science Colloquium. It's October 7th, 2016, and I'm Emily Ritter. I'm an assistant professor at the University of California, Merced, and I'm the coordinator of online speaker series for the Peace Science Society. And in particular, this is the online Peace Science Colloquium, where we try to present new and ongoing exciting research in peace science of all different types. And today we're having a presentation from Adrian Florea. He is a lecturer or assistant professor at the University of Glasgow. And he's going to present a paper today entitled Rebel Governance. We're joined by four excellent discussants that we're so excited to have with us. Bridget Coggins is an associate professor of political science at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And Reyko Huang is an assistant professor at the Department of International Affairs at the Bush School at Texas A&M. Stewart is an assistant professor, or is going to be very soon an assistant professor at the university at American University, and right now she's a postdoc researcher at University of Virginia in the Department of Politics. And we have Zachariah Mampilly, who is an associate professor of political science and the director of Africana Studies at Vassar College. So I'd like to thank all of you wonderful people for reading this paper, and we're going to have comments from you after a short presentation from Adrian. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Adrian.
Okay. Thanks again, Emily, for organizing the colloquium, and to Peter for putting all the pieces together. Hopefully the technical glitches will be minimal. And
yes, we should always thank Peter. Thank you, Peter.
Right, exactly. And many thanks to the panelists for taking time on a Friday afternoon to talk about nasty things to some extent, right? Rebel governance. Let me provide you a bit of a background on how this paper came about. I do mostly work on civil war and separatism, like many IR scholars or conflict scholars these days. And for part of my earlier work, I conducted the research.
Oh, your audio. Adrian, your audio. We can't hear you.
Exercise a monopoly over the use of force in a territory, and also provide public and social services to the population that they control. Obviously, this paper is situated in the larger, I would say, larger and emerging literature on the rebel governance, and many of you have already contributed with books or articles to that body of works, and attempt to explain, hopefully to explain why some rebels engage in fairly extensive governance activities, while others do not necessarily embark on developing a complex apparatus of self-rule in the areas they control. So with this paper, I'm trying to explain the variation in rebel governance. In prior works, rebel governance has been used to account for various conflict dynamics, such as post-conflict democratization, Reyko's work, such as or negotiation processes. But to my knowledge, there have been fewer attempts to explain this variability in the extent to which rebels engage in governance activities throughout conflicts. So that's the basic theoretical impetus for this paper. So in order to explain the variability of governance activities conducted by rebels, I dwell on an interdisciplinary literature, primarily the one emerging from international relations, comparative politics, as well as economics, and take a look at a few environmental and organizational factors that have been suggested to influence this variation in the degree of rebel governance that we observe across conflicts. Specifically, I test, hopefully, 4 explanations that emerge from these diverse literatures. Natural resource explanation, which primarily holds that if rebels have incentives to eschew productive activities and engage in predatory behavior in the presence of expropriable mineral resources. A second explanation, which is situated in the economics literature and which focuses primarily on asset specificity, on the type of assets that are available to rebels in the territory that they control. Here, one argument that emerges from the economics literature is that immobile assets shift the rebels' equilibrium strategy from predation, from banditry to governance. A third theoretical account focuses on external military support, and here the literature is pointing towards two directions. On the one hand, some people argue that outside sponsors enable rebels to consolidate their state building or governance practices. And the second strand of literature argues that in the presence of external military support, some rebels may have rational incentives to just stay away from the onerous process of governing or extensively governing the territory that they control. And finally, I look at organizational behavior explanation for the variability in rebel governing practices. And in this case, I dwell on the fragmentation literature, on the large fragmentation literature in Civil War. And here from the literature, we also have two competing or alternative explanations. On the one hand, some folks argue that fragmentation might reduce the ability of rebels to govern the territory. On the other hand, others, especially the more area studies oriented people, have been found to suggest that in some cases, internal fissions or fragmentation, splittering, however we may label it, may actually encourage competition for the loyalty of the local population and actually translate in a larger extent, in a greater extent of governance. Now, ideally, in order to test these explanations that emerge from several strands of existing work, one would look at all rebel organizations in all civil wars, ideally after World War II. Unfortunately, data limitations prevent such a research design. And this is important because one of the key arguments that emerges from the rebel governance literature is that certain structural characteristics of the insurgency, particularly the goal of the rebellion, whether the rebels aim to overthrow the government or whether they attempt to establish separate state or achieve some type of self-determination, as well as the extent of territorial control, fundamentally shape incentives to govern territory more extensively or less so. So in order to achieve the highest level of control for the extent of territorial control and the goal of the insurgency, in this paper, I test expectations about the variation in rebel governance by looking at a subset of rebellions, those self-determination groups that have already established control over territory and exclusive control over territory. That is, those rebels that have established a de facto state, an unrecognized state-like entity that achieves, that strives to achieve the independence or has issued declarations of independence or has behaved as if it wanted independence, but also an entity that has established exclusive territorial control. So the research design hopefully allows the highest possible degree of control for the structural characteristics that would permit such an analysis to be carried out. I should reiterate that again, in an ideal world, I would want to test these expectations on the entire population of civil wars with comprehensive data on the degree of territorial control for all rebel organizations after World War II. Now, I won't go into the definition of the de facto state. Basically, this is a separatist entity that resembles a state in many characteristics except for national legal status. In order to capture the degree of rebel governance in de facto states, I collected data on a number of governance or state-like institutions that were present in each de facto state for its survival period. And this is a count variable, which includes multiple indicators. For instance, whether the de facto state displays an executive, whether it establishes a separate legislature or regional council, whether it institutionalizes a court or semi-formalized legal system, whether it implements a civilian tax system, and here I mean regularized taxation rather than unsystematic taxation practices, whether it establishes a separate educational system, a separate welfare system. In a nutshell, the indicators for the governance institutions present in each de facto state capture the range of extractive and redistributive activities that we typically find with an organization, be it a recognized nation state or a non-state actor. For independent variables, I rely on existing measures of mineral resources with data from Ross. With respect to the asset specificity explanation, I look at whether there's an economic base in the de facto state that should correlate positively in theory with the degree, with the extent of rebel governance. Finally, I also collected data on the extent of military support for rebels, and with respect to the fragmentation explanation, to the organizational structure explanation, I rely on the number of factions that each de facto state displays in each year. And the empirical findings provide support from these hypotheses and less support for others. Basically, the important story here is that in the presence of external military systems, we observe lower extent of rebel governance in de facto state. Perhaps counterintuitively, those fragmented de facto states are most likely to provide an extensive governance structure. And here in the paper, I provide several explanations for this finding. In addition, I also, the empirical results also unveil some other patterns which relate to the presence of peacekeepers, the relative capability between the rebels and the government, and the presence of war. So in a nutshell, with the presence of peacekeepers, we see a higher extent of rebel governance. We also see similar patterns of extensive rebel governance when rebels are stronger militarily than the government. Warfare, as expected, intuitively reduces rebel governance across these conflicts. So, in a nutshell, this is the main. This is the gist of the working paper, and I look forward to your comments.
Great, thank you so much. And with that, I will open it up for if Adrian, you'd like to unshare your slides so we can see your lovely face. And then we will open it up for anyone who'd like to start the comments. And again, I'll have Adrian respond pretty quickly to anything that comes up.
I'm happy to jump in. If,
okay, Zachariah.
So I have a few things, but first I just want to say that I think the paper was really well done. It's clear. It makes very clear justifications for the choices that you make. Theoretically and empirically, I think it was quite sophisticated. So overall, congrats on a strong paper, and I think you're pretty close to having something that is publishable.
Thank you.
I think it's very well done. So you're close. My suggestions aren't fundamental. They're more kind of at the conceptual level, and there are some other things that I want to talk about. But let me just start with sort of how you conceptualize rebel governance itself. And I think that was something that I wanted you to address. I understood the choices you made, but I guess my biggest concern was that underlying kind of much of the empirical work is this assumption that the extensivity of rebel governance is a proxy for effectiveness, or it's a sense that it's better to have more extensive or more complex structures, and that especially when you sort of situate that as a spectrum, right? So moving from less extensive or less good governance to more extensive and more good governance was a normative choice, right? And I understand why you make it, but I think that I wanted to see a little bit more, because one of the types of variation that you don't capture in this paper is that rebels may be choosing fundamentally different modalities of rule that are not about complexity. Right, and so here I'm thinking, for example, of something like, I don't know if you've seen Christophe Teteka's paper on the FAPC in Congo, where he refers to the FAPC being like a Monaco-like state, right, where the governance structure is actually minimalist by design, and that actually led to more effective governance from the perspective of civilians. Right, your sort of categorization, something like the FAPC model, would normatively be understood as ineffective governance, right? And rather, than understanding it almost as like a political choice, right, by both the civilians and the rebels to say, look, maybe the rebels shouldn't be so extensively involved in governance. Maybe it's actually better for the rebels to establish a minimal state-like apparatus and allow for private sector actors to step in and take over these services, right? The outcome in that case could actually be normatively desirable. So it's more of a philosophical question, but I think it gets to the question of variation, because you initially set it up as two questions that you're asking. Why do some rebels engage in extensive governance activities? And then the second, why might explain the variation in rebel governance? And I think the paper is focused much more on the first question and doesn't really capture the range of possible modalities of rule that rebels actually engage in, which may not neatly coincide with the less governance to more governance spectrum. Right? And I'll leave it at that. But,
and Megan wanted to jump in on that.
Yeah, so I mean, this kind of brings up two comments that I had, which are just kind of how you're conceptualizing both rebels and also building off of Zach's points, how you're conceptualizing governance. So I'll start with sort of building off what Zach just said, and then we can come back to like how you're conceptualizing rebels. So one of the things that I had was one of the things that sort of struck me was that the way that you selected the institutions that you were focusing on and your variation, you were measuring variation in different institutions, but not only could variation be measured in sort of in terms of modalities, but also in terms of its extensiveness and ability for civilians to access those resources, right? Because and I think this kind of gets at what you mean by governance fundamentally. Because for me, my understanding is how an actor allocates resources and who gets those resources and why. So I mean, that's how I understand it. But there's other ways that people can understand it. And so the variation in the institutions that you're picking up on could be how rebels choose to allocate, but not necessarily who accesses and why. So I was just kind of curious as to what you or how you conceived of governance in particular. And I think it's somewhat the particular institutions that you choose. I don't necessarily know that they have a natural rebel analog, right? Like I wasn't exactly sure what's an executive of a rebel group. Is that a leader? If that's a leader, then every rebel group has one, right? Or like what's a legislature in the government? Is that like is that the Comintern? So then most communist insurgencies are going to have that too. So to me, the institutions that you picked were there. It just didn't, the analog between them and between governance wasn't necessarily there. And particularly like with the media one or the foreign affairs one, there might not be any civilian interaction or even any of the judicial side. So that was something of interest to me. I don't know, Emily,
should I?
Yeah, why don't you hold for your next point, and we'll let you, because that was a lot between the two comments. Exactly. There was a lot to right. So. Okay.
Fantastic comments. Excellent. So let me start first with Zach. You're absolutely right, and I think that's an issue that needs to be addressed in a future iteration of this paper. That basically I'm looking at the first question more than the second question. And you raised an important point that informed actually the data coding process, and namely whether the the fact that a governance institution exists also implies that it's actually operational, that it does something, right? And that's a challenge for this type of data, as I'm sure all of us are aware. And to clarify the coding process, I relied on both primary and secondary sources and tried to code for the presence, for the effective presence of each government institutions only after it has been described in at least 3 sources. So if at least 3 sources said that, for instance, in Transnistria, there was a Supreme Soviet Council which legislated, and this comes back also to Megan's point, which engaged, in legal matters, right? Issued legislation for the local population. Then the presence of a separate legal system was coded as such only after those characteristics were explicitly reported in at least 3 sources, right? When it comes to the rebel governance, I'm very happy that you asked this question, both Zach and Megan, because I think I have a broader understanding of rebel governance than what is usually the case in the literature. I look at the rebel governance as the whole ensemble, if you wish, of activities aimed at the provision of public order, extraction, and redistribution. Now, typically, rebel governance is understood as the provision of public services to civilians during war, right? Which to me is a bit of a limited understanding of the whole complexity of rebel government that we observe in this type of conflicts, especially in this type of entities, where you have so much variation in what happens vis-a-vis state-building practices, governing institutions provided by these rebels during peacetime and during wartime. Governance, to come back to my original point, for me encompasses both the extractive aspect, so especially the regularized taxation aspect, which I don't think it's sufficiently covered in the literature, and I don't think it's also sufficiently captured in the empirical data that we have, as well as the redistributive aspect of the phenomena. Now, let's see.
But while you're thinking for just a second, Bridget, did you have a 2-finger?
I did. I think that one of the things that might help to kind of orient what we're talking about with respect to what is rebellion and what is governance is that what you've got when you look at secessionist de facto states is you're scoping it, you're kind of funneling it way down. And in particular, you're funneling it towards those groups that choose to adopt very state-like practices. And so I think that your indicators of governance flow from that, but it also means that you're missing a whole range of what rebel governance is for those actors that are center-seeking or in intercommunal conflicts or even social revolutions, right? We've got a lot of rebel governance that's happening that takes on a fundamentally different form than just trying to replicate state-like institutions. And so I think that that's okay that you do that. And I think that it makes sense given your subset of conflicts that you're looking at. But I think that it's also important to provide clear signposts to the reader that suggest that that's what you're doing and give good justification for why you're doing that. So try to not talk about, I wondered at several points in the setup when you're talking about Weinstein and those folks, whether or not those were actually relevant arguments, whether they would say that their arguments apply to the subset that you're testing.
Right.
And
I think,
I've got 2 fingers from Reyko and then again from Zach, and then we'll get back to Adrian. Okay.
As I listen in on the conversation, I realize that you actually do have a pretty clear idea of what you mean by rebel governance. And I think it's just a matter of actually fleshing it out in the paper, because what you just said about extraction and distribution makes a lot of sense to me. And I think it's a great thing that we have different scholars now talking about rebel governance in different ways and coming at the topic from different ways, and even coming to the operationalization in different ways. So you have your specific definition in operationalization. I have mine. It's actually very similar to yours. I know Megan has her ongoing work, and then the others that you cited in your paper. And so I think it's a great thing that we actually have a bunch of data collection efforts going on at the same time that are all sort of intersecting with one another in really productive ways. So I think it's a matter of justifying your particular conception and approach much more strongly, and then acknowledging that there are others, as you, I think, already do in your paper, right? So I think that's the way I see it. I think it's a really productive exercise that we are all sort of approaching this at the same time, but in different ways, as long as we justify our own approaches and our own theoretical drives and conceptualizations.
Nice. Zach?
Yeah, I think Reyko's point is really good, and Bridget's is as well. And so I just want to echo that. And what I would say is that what struck me is that I was convinced by your choice, right? Like, at first, I was kind of hesitant to kind of accept the logic of rebel governance applying to de facto states. I've written about that, so I don't need to reiterate my points here. But actually, reading through it, I was like, okay, I see what he's doing, right? In terms of the controls that you're able to implement, in terms of empirical work, I thought that was a very strong justification, right? The question of territorial control, the question of secessionist groups, it is a theme, as you point out, that is regularly raised in this literature. Reyko makes a similar point in regards to secessionist groups. So I think that was a good strategy, right? So it actually convinced me that, okay, this makes sense. What I was surprised is that you have this footnote, I think it's number 13, because actually for me, the strongest justification for your approach was that de facto states actually provide the best data. And so that is a good justification when we're talking about a research area that is in many ways defined by the lack of data, right? Yeah. And so I was struck that you tucked that away into a footnote, because I would have, put that up front and say, look, rebel governance as a field of inquiry has faced a severe challenge in terms of accessing data. A number of scholars have tried to get around this in different approaches. I use small n case comparisons. Others have tried to do larger collections. But we all, I think, confront this very fundamental fact that we know that there are these hugely important factors like territorial control, of which we know very little about. Right. Most of the time in the literature or in the data sets, it's like a binary data, whether the rebels control territory or not. Yeah. We all know that that's insufficient when we're talking about groups that exist for 30 years, whose control is constantly shifting over those 30 years in ways that are important for the analysis that we're trying to conduct. And so I would actually want to see much more clearly, look, as you do in this footnote, the data constraints are massive. Right? We're not studying the U.S. Congress here. We don't have reliable or durable data. This is new. And so you're making choices. And these choices are constrained by the reality that the only people who can give us access to this data are people who are on the ground, and that they are, A, deeply unreliable, and B, concerned about different things. Right? And especially when we're talking about rebellions from 1948 on, much of that information is just lost to history. Right, systematically. I read a lot of stuff from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and governance is like even by movement insiders, is always like a secondary or tertiary concern. Right? Yeah. Even if we were to accept the accounts of movement insiders, it would face huge, both limitations in terms of the bias, but also they just don't think it's that important. Right? There are some figures, some movements that take it more seriously, but by and large, governance has not really been an area of focus. Right? And so I just think you have a capacity to make the case. Right, and say, look, data collection is extremely difficult, but by focusing on de facto states that have the most state-like structures, because that was a big flag for me, like Bridget mentioned as well, the advantage is that they actually are the only ones that might keep records. They might actually have some outside observers who come in and provide independent accounts, and that becomes a justification, right? Because we just can't collect that kind of data about, say, ISIS or the LRA or other groups, right, in a way that we can with de facto states. And to me, that was a part of the story, not something that should be tucked away into a footnote.
Okay, Adrian, can you?
Yes, thank you. This is very encouraging to a great extent. I think the puzzle for me, from a theoretical and empirical perspective, with de facto states is, all these entities attempt to attain both domestic and national legitimacy. Governance, the provision of governance to local civilians is part of the social contract that presumably they would have a rational incentive of pursuing, right? So in a nutshell, this type of separatist rebel movements have rational incentives to engage in quite an extensive governance framework. Nonetheless, we see much variation across the governance practices across these armed non-state actors. And I think, to me, that that's a puzzle, because given the rational incentives that these rebel organizations, technically they resemble states in many characteristics, but we commonly conceptualize them as armed non-state actors or armed rebel organizations. So the puzzle is why we observe this variation across de facto states that have rational incentives to provide a wide array, an extensive array of governance activities to the local population. It's a signaling mechanism, right? Governing both to local civilians, which ensures a social contract and local legitimacy, but as well as to the national community. But I fully agree with you that perhaps the paper would be strengthened by a conceptual clarification of what I mean by governance. Bridget, I think you're right, and that my understanding harps on the idea that here we have some non-state actors which replicate many functions of statehood. That's basically the understanding that I have here. And the question is then, what explains this variation in the accoutrement, statehood accoutrement that we see across many rebel organizations? But in hindsight, I have to admit that that doesn't come across clearly in the paper.
I've got 2 fingers from Megan.
Yeah, no, Adrian, I think it's interesting because I had the same reaction in reading your paper. I actually thought what was more surprising to me was why doesn't everybody, so 10 is your modal outcome. So I was thinking, why doesn't everybody have a 10, right? Especially because war's not going on, there's peacekeepers everywhere. You know, so they're already building. So why don't de facto states develop these institutions?
Right.
So sort of flipping it on the head, not so much why isn't it more extensive, but rather like these are the institutions you need to become a state. You have these isomorphic pressures to build institutions in a particular way. And not everybody's doing it. And that's really weird because if you want to be a state, you should be doing it. And so I almost wonder if it's the converse that's more interesting than saying it the other way, because I think when you present it as why isn't it more open, why isn't it more extensive and robust, I think that's when you start to get into some of the questions that we've brought up here. And so I wondered if you had thought about framing it in that different way from that angle.
Yes, actually, I think the paper is in need of a reframing to focus on exactly on that specific question. Starting with the variation in governance puzzle without introducing the incentives that these armed non-state actors have doesn't necessarily foot the bill, I think. So I think that's a great suggestion, and perhaps the best way forward is to start with the puzzle of the variability in state-like institutions displayed by de facto states, and try to account for this variation, especially given their ultimate goal of achieving some degree of recognition internationally. I mean, recognition either in the form of achieving, sovereign statehood, or achieving some type of acknowledgement from other international partners.
So one of the arguments that I noticed that was absent from the build-up that I thought might be interestingly pursued, given your indicators of rebel governance, was the argument that Ritter and now Ryan Griffiths have advanced that suggests that the state-like or sub-state institutions boundaries are really what predicts to whether or not you're going to be successful. And so whether or not those notions of, or those different indicators of governance that you have are truly independent and forged by the separatists themselves, or whether they're co-opting existing regional or local institutions and calling them their own. And so I wondered if in the coding, if you had thought about that, because especially with your Transnistria examples, I mean, these are by and large co-optations of existing institutions, right? With the earliest Chechen conflict, it also was something much more akin to taking over regional governance institutions that already existed. So they would score, at least according to what I think you're coding, they would score really highly, but they're relying on existing infrastructure and existing institutions, and they're just using them towards their separatist goals.
Right. Now that's another excellent point, and to some extent it pertains to an endogeneity problem, right? Whether one can also argue whether some separatists established governing institutions in order to arrive at a de facto state, rather than the other way around. Ritter does provide a good institutional explanation for what happens after separatism or after self-determination. And in the code book, in order to account for pre-existing structures, because this is part of the explanation, right? That is there. Pre-existing structures may enable rebels to build the subsequent governing framework on which they can legitimize their claim and also expand the range of extraction and the redistributive activities. For these entities, for de facto states, in order to capture characteristics of these pre-existing structures, in the data, I only have a variable on whether the territory was autonomous, right? Which would speak to the dynamics that you mentioned in your comment, but not more fine-grained than that. I should acknowledge.
Megan, did you still have a one finger?
Sorry. No, I have other points I can make. I don't want to like stymie the conversation though or anything. But I mean, to kind of build off of Bridget's point, in reading it, I sort of wondered whether they were actually rebels governing, right? So just looking at some of your cases, like Kurdistan, there are two major rebel groups in Kurdistan. There's the PUK and the KDP, and I actually think this might be related to your fragmentation finding too.
Yes.
So if the KDP is providing 5 of your institutions and the PUK is providing 5 separate institutions, then they're going to have a score of 10, but there's going to be 2 rebel groups. So like higher levels of fragmentation. But Kurdistan is just the unit of analysis. So I'm wondering if that, because your actual unit of analysis is de facto state and not necessarily rebel group, it's conflating the fragmentation findings. And because that's something that you focus on, I don't know. I was just wondering if you looked at that, or in like Eritrea, for example, there's the EDM, there's the ELF, there's the EPLF, all during the time period you're looking at. And Fertilin, in East Timor, there's Fertilin, there's UDT, there's Apodeti. And Fertilin is not a de facto state, but East Timor is. And so I was just curious, and it kind of gets at a lot to what Bridget was saying, is that some of these institutions might already exist and they're co-opted by rebels. But when you're testing it, your unit of analysis isn't that individual rebel group. So even if they, like in my data set, even if they do co-opt it and they're still working or funding the organization, I still count that as governance. But because you take the space and not the actor who's engaging in governance, I'm wondering if that's perhaps driving or conflating your effects with fragmentation. So I didn't know if you had thought about that.
Go ahead, Adrian.
Okay. Should I respond or?
Yeah, go ahead, please. I'm sorry.
Okay. All right. Yeah, that's an important consideration that inform part of the data collection process, because ideally one would want to collect data for rebel organization or rebel group as the unit of analysis rather than for the territory. So in this case, we have what resembles a nation-state year rather than a rebel dyad type of unit of analysis, which doesn't provide us with the most fine-grained data that we would ideally have. The coding was driven by come back to the coding issues, to the presence of these governance institutions. I coded for governance institutions established by the dominant rebel organization in the respective de facto state. So the rebel organization that had a monopoly over the use of force. And I also coded for the presence of other factions or splinter groups that existed during that specific time in the de facto state, rather than the type of institutions that were established to continue with the example of Ritter by EPLF when ELF was in power. So for Ethiopia, for the ELF years, the governance institutions capture those structures established by the ELF. After EPLF took power, the data set captures the institutions established by the EPLF. Again, I'm very grateful for all these questions, and I look forward to any other suggestions that would address the coding issue. It was pretty hard, especially to navigate through primary and secondary sources and also to maintain the 3 resource criterion for each governance institution in each year in order to come up with these codings. I also had an independent coder for a subsample and with a fairly encouraging intercoder reliability score. So whatever is available in the out there in the secondary data, in the primary data, I think it may have been covered. But again, any suggestions you may have will be extremely appreciated.
Well,
Megan, and then Reyko, and then Zach. Go ahead, Megan.
I just wanted to say it wasn't like an issue with the coding, and I can completely empathize. I thought for me, it was more just like an issue with the phrasing and the framing. And that was where the issue was coming from. Like I completely empathize with the coding challenges, but just in the way that it's framed and presented, it reads a little bit differently than perhaps what you might be testing. And so that was all. Not to change your coding or anything.
Reyko.
So not to complicate things further, but I actually did have a lot of questions about your coding. I think you need to be a little bit more transparent in the paper because, I mean, the challenges of coding rebel governance are just really obvious. So I think it's just good practice to identify what they are and tell us what they are straight up. And especially since you code governance annually, and I had no idea how you did that because, as you know, in my data set, I coded for the conflict, and that was challenging enough.
Yes.
And so how would you even know like what year a particular group opened their first school or when it might have closed so that you code a 0? And how much variation is there in some of these variables? That you don't discuss at all. So I would love to see more of the descriptive statistics over time. And how you actually went about identifying like what year did a rebel group build a hospital? And what are your sources? Even to just provide some examples and then acknowledge some of the challenges that you faced, I think would be very helpful for this type of fine-grained annual data. And if there isn't a whole lot of variation, also the methodology comes into question, right? So we do want to know how much variation is there over time. If the dependent variables don't change that much in value, then you might actually want to do more of like a collapse the data into a conflict as a unit of analysis, or even do more of a cross tabulation or a bivariate analysis just to back up your current methodology. So I think we do want to know how much variation there is over time, how you actually identify them. And the reason I think this is really important is that I think some of the variables that you code as governance might vary with some of your independent variables. For example, this is wartime. There is just so little information, so little accurate information. Even the information that we can code based on available information is dependent on what they were able to gather, right? The original information providers, whether journalists or scholars, could provide. And so when it's a zero, when something is coded as a zero, the problem with governance is that you never know whether it's a zero because they didn't do it, or it's a zero because we never found the information that they actually built a school. And nobody knows, actually, right? Only the rebels will know whether a zero is an accurate zero or it's a false negative. Mm-hmm. So the problem is that some of these dependent variables values might be correlated with independent variables like ongoing war. And so the reason that you actually do find a correlation, I think, right, between the war variable and less governance could be, coming from the fact that you're finding less information during ongoing war. And likewise with peacekeeping, when there are peacekeepers on the ground, we have so much more information. And so I think you want to address these issues and just be upfront about them.
Zach, was your point on this, or should we let Adrian?
It's really different. So
okay, let's let Adrian respond, and then we'll come back to Zach.
Okay, lots of excellent points again. Now for the data collection process, I started with the basic search in LexisNexis for keywords. For instance, let's say we are looking for an education system in Nagorno-Karabakh. The key search items were education, school, Nagorno-Karabakh, and other alternative names for the de facto state, such as Artsakh, and so on, and which produces a series of results. I read each report independently, looked for the keywords and for the presence of an educational system being reported in those sources, English-based sources. After this first identification of the presence of the characteristics of interest, I went on the book search on pretty much everything that has been written on these entities. And here, by saying everything, it's not quite a lot, right? I think there are about 25 books or so written on Nagorno-Karabakh.
Most of them in Armenian.
Yeah, most of them are in Armenian, exactly. But in English literature, I think there are about 25 or so, even at most. So that information captured through the LexisNexis search was triangulated with whatever was present in the books. Finally, I was a doctoral student at Indiana, and we have an excellent area studies program there. So in order to ensure face validity for some of my codings, I asked some of the area studies specialists to randomly pick a couple of observations and say whether they have face validity, whether they are people who have done research, field research in places like Abkhazia and Nagorno-Karabakh. So basically that was the strategy behind the coding. Of course, when you rely on secondary sources, I also rely on primary sources when they were available. For instance, for South Sudan, Zach surely knows a lot more than me. Lam Akol, for instance, has written a couple of books and a couple of memoirs on the operations of the ESPLA during periods of territorial control, during tenures and territorial control, and so on. Unfortunately, we don't have access to a lot of primary data on what these rebel organizations are doing. And we have to be satisfied with second best measurement. And this is exactly what I try to compromise for this data collection process. But as Reyko mentioned, there are always concerned about false positives and false negatives when it comes to using this type of strategy. Because on the other hand, an unimportant or a de facto state or a rebel organization that may not be necessarily perceived by outsiders as being quite important, take Ajaria before 2004. How many reports have you read or heard about Ajaria in the news? So even though there may be an issue of false negatives, so a state-like institution may be present but may not be reported as such. That's why I embarked on this three-pronged strategy to address potential false positive and false negatives: LexisNexis search, book search, as well as face validity with a randomly selected sample from area studies specialists, plus independent coding from for a small subset.
Could I just mention? So I think that's terrific. I think what I meant to say was I'm actually absolutely sympathetic to the challenges. I think I would just like to see a greater discussion of some of the challenges that you may have faced. Right.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It's an excellent point. I'm planning to eventually submit a book proposal based on my whole work on de facto states, and hopefully that will be enough space to discuss the challenges for the data collection. But yes, also there are challenges with false positives over reporting bias, right? So we are confronted with that issue on a regular basis. But I think the challenge can be overcome by systematically adopting a rigorous coding procedure, and that's exactly what I try to do for this data.
You're describing it really well interpersonally as we're chatting about it. But insofar as a publication strategy is concerned, you should know that the Civil War literature is a harsh, harsh mistress. And so be as explicit as you can. I mean, when real work has been done, really point to the real work that's been done, because that will, this is about rebel signaling to external audiences, at least to some extent. Signal to your external audience that you really know your shit and what you're talking about. Because if it doesn't come through, you will get a litany of these kinds of, not that these are niggling questions, but kind of little piddly questions that you actually have thought a lot about and have over obstacles that you've overcome. And so do point to that, signal to people that work has been done.
Briefly in the paper and then at great length in the appendix.
Especially, I fully agree with you. The paper doesn't necessarily cover those important aspects of data collection and coding.
Oh, sorry. Zachariah.
Yeah, so I mean, I would reiterate what Reyko and Bridget have said. I mean, you actually do talk about it in footnote 13.
But it's in note 13, yeah.
And like they said, I think acknowledging the limitations is the obvious thing to do here, and put it in the body of the text, because it's an important point. It may be the fundamental point on which your research stands. So I would address it directly and not tuck it away in a footnote. I want to shift the conversation a little bit away from the data collection strategy, because I think that's going to be a constant area of concern, and I'm sure you've thought about this much more than is represented in the paper. So I look forward to seeing the book, right? Because that'll allow you a full discussion of these issues.
Hopefully there's going to be one.
But I had a very specific question, and maybe I was really struck by your findings. On one level, I'm still not sure if I buy your logic around factionalization being good for governance, but I can say something about that. I guess my bigger concern is that, in some ways I felt like you buried the lead when you talk about natural resources, right? Because you find very directly that there is little evidence for perhaps what is the most influential theory about rebel behavior, right? This idea that natural resources or the presence of natural resources leads to a decline in rebel civilian relations or a decline in governance provision is a fairly strong finding. And to me, like, you just sort of report that finding and they don't provide any analysis. And I think it gets especially complicated because, on one side you say natural resources don't have the predicted effect that you would expect. And I was happy to see that, because I believe the same thing. But then you, in the very next sentence, will talk about how foreign patronage does have a negative effect on governance outcomes. And if you actually look at the resources on Weinstein's book in particular, for him it's the same mechanism, right? The reason that natural resources depress governance provision is the same logic as to why foreign patronage depresses governance. And for you to find support for one and not the other, and then not even talk about the mechanism, was striking to me, right? Because what I wanted to see is, here's why Weinstein got it wrong. Here's why we see these divergent outcomes, despite the fact that the mechanism may be present in both cases, because you don't actually refute the possibility that, as far as I can understand your discussion of foreign patronage, it's the same exact mechanism, right? It provides an incentive for the rebels to not pay attention to governance issues and instead rely on this income from abroad, right? That's the same mechanism that Weinstein identifies for natural resources. So you seem to be saying that the mechanism is correct, but it only works when it comes to foreign patronage and not natural resources. And that, to me, requires further explication, right? I wanted to see something where, like, okay, well, this is why it works in the context of foreign patronage, but doesn't work in the context of natural resources. And to me, that's a huge finding, but one that doesn't really receive much analysis, right? Similarly, with the sort of question of fractionalization, like again, in some ways, I want to see more, right? I want to see like why it is that we see this outcome. Like you sort of point to differing theoretical predictions, right? I think that's correct, that the literature does have these different ideas about what the impact of fractionalization can do. But to me, like when I saw that outcome, I was like, okay, on one level, like it may be that it's not simply the presence of fractionalization, right? But rather the sort of political processes that are related to fractionalization. And that to me would be an interesting finding. So I keep thinking about the South Sudanese case. It's like the SPLA fractionalizes multiple times across its life. But in one particular context, when it fractionalized, the question of civilian treatment became the central issue that split the movement, right? And so in that context, fractionalization actually could spur further governance provision. Yeah. But groups fractionalize over all kinds of things. It's rare that rebels will fractionalize and say, well, we're going to break away from you because you're mistreating our civilians, right? Most of the time it's like, well, we're going to break away from you because we want a bigger share of the pie. We want more military appointments, whatever it is, right? So to me, I just want some contextualization. It could be even hypothetical because you haven't done that research. You don't know. You didn't actually connect the reason why fractionalization occurs to the governance outcomes that we see. Kind of the logical secondary step to me is like you have these empirical patterns. They're really interesting. We don't know exactly what accounts for them, but I wanted to see some discussion where you sort of speculate, right? Here's why we see different outcomes in the foreign patronage and the natural resources case. Here's why we see contradictory outcomes when it comes to fractionalization, why fractionalization sometimes can be positive for governance. Even if you don't have the empirical proof at this point, I still think it's an important task for this paper. And I really want, I just felt like those were things that like would allow you to finish the paper, right? Without just sort of pointing out that I found these patterns and they're interesting, right? You need to take it to that next step. And
I've got 2 fingers from Reyko. Oh, I'm sorry, I cut you off.
I'm done.
I've got 2 fingers from Reyko, and then we'll have Adrian respond.
I think my comment is related to what Zachariah was just saying. I think the one thing that you might want to do in the theoretical discussion is, so you have 4 hypotheses, and they're really clearly laid out and make a lot of sense, but there isn't really like an overarching theory that connects them. I think what you say is that you want to test hypotheses on the environmental and organizational factors. But is there something you could say more about why you think, choosing these factors or these 4 variables as opposed to any others? What drove you to this point of picking these 4 and adjudicating between them as opposed to other variables? And that might be a way to get at this question of why is fragmentation more interesting to you than, let's say, peacekeeping, which is just a control variable. So if you could say more theoretically, then that would help you to address more, in a more interesting way the findings.
I've got 2 fingers from Megan as well. Oh, you're muted. You're muted.
No, I had much of the same reaction as Reyko did. I was reading and I thought, you actually had like sort of 2 baskets of hypotheses. One was fragmentation, and then one was sort of the economic or organizational structure of the rebel group. And to me, there was, I thought about ideology, I thought about peacekeeping, I thought about whether or not insurgents were at war as being reasons that could explain variation in governance that weren't tested or even mentioned, except for like in your appendix or something like that. And I also, to build off of 2 of Zach's points, the EPLF also split from the ELF because of concerns of a lack of openness in civilian governance, civilian inclusion. And that part of, I think, what could also be going on in terms of the mechanism is that military aid is not fungible. It can only be used for military purposes. So you can't use a gun to fund a school unless you're selling the gun secondarily, whereas natural resources can be more easily converted into money that's being used to fund schools and things like that. So that might be something to push further as well. Sorry.
Adrian.
Wow, excellent. Lots of good suggestions of moving this research forward. Yes, after reading myself and I tend to be highly critical of my own work. I also agree with you that it comes across as a bit atheoretical because it's a work in progress. I think for the stage of the research, this particular paper was more of a plausibility probe rather than just a theoretical development. If you wish to put it even in derogatory terms, it was more of a correlational analysis rather than just a coherent theory at this stage of rebel governance. However, excuse me. However, the common thread, the theoretical thread, emerges from the organizational incentives of rebel groups in general and separatist leaders in particular to engage in the onerous task of state building. At the same time, that common theoretical thread does not emerge clearly in the paper, and I fully agree with you on that one. So yes, Zach, Reyko, the theory needs to be better fleshed out. That's for sure. The fungibility explanation is credible. Thank you for suggesting that. The mechanism-based approach is an alternative way of moving this research forward, and situating it within the larger, Weinstein hypothesizing or Weinstein mechanism may be a way to go forward. I really don't know at this stage. It's just a process of integrating many useful comments from you. But to come back to the fungibility argument, at face value, yes, I would buy that explanation. Although military aid can come in various forms that can be quasi-fungible, right? You can use certain, military hardware to guard the area where you establish a school or where you establish a specific local council for legislating local affairs. Could see a reviewer bringing up that point as well, but nonetheless, it's an excellent suggestion.
We are out of time, and this has been excellent. And the time went really fast this time. So, if Adrian, if you have anything you'd like to say to wrap up, or if anybody has any last minute things they'd like to throw out there.
I would like to just thank you for everything you have shared with me today, and also I'd like to thank you for your work that you have been done on the topic and otherwise, because as I'm sure it's clear from my paper and my other research, I build extensively on each of your work, and that's extremely helpful for coming up hopefully with a more comprehensive understanding of rebel governance in specifically, but also rebel behavior more generally. So thank you again. And I hope to see you soon.
Yes, thank you so much.
Perhaps at the ISA.
Yeah.
I'll see you in December.
Yes, and I'll see you in December, Bridget.
To Adrian for an excellent paper and discussion. Thank you to our great discussants for your time and your reading the paper and fitting it into your schedule and having really, really excellent comments today. If anyone is joining us now or late, then you should go back and watch the beginning and check out the presentation of the paper that Adrian has provided. This paper is not on the website because it's either under review or it's about to go under review. So if you have interest in the paper, you should definitely email Adrian, or you could email psscolloquia@gmail.com, and we could put you in touch with Adrian. If you have comments or questions, please go ahead and put them on the YouTube page, and Adrian can check them out afterwards. Thank you again to everybody, and I hope everybody tunes in on for our next presentation, which is on, sorry, I had to look it up, October 28th, so it's in 3 weeks this time. Michael Kenwick from Penn State is going to present on civilian control self-reinforcing, a measurement-based analysis of civil-military relations. So with that, thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Have a great weekend.